When we look at different types of folkloric creature, we often encounter the same types in different places, such as mermaids or fairies. But occasionally you encounter a creature so localised that it only appears in a single place, and the blue men of the Minch are one such example. Feared by sailors, the blue men of the Minch lived in the strait between the Shiant Islands and Long Island, and the stretch of water is known as Fear Gorm, or the Stream of the Blue Men. Most descriptions mention how similar they look to humans, if those humans had blue skin, that is. They usually have grey faces, white beards and long arms, and they're also fearfully strong. They're also humanoids with a fondness for pulling ships into the depths. So let's find out more about the Blue Men of the Minch in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are rattling on with Underwater Month, and I suddenly realised that I'd never done the Blue Men of the Minch before, and we have looked at Scottish underwater creatures before. Obviously, I've done Selkies, I've done Kelpies, we've even looked at the water horse and the water bull. So, we have been looking at quite a few of these different creatures, but I'd never done this particular set before. So I thought, well, we're doing Underwater Month, so now's as good a time to do it as any. So what exactly are the Blue Men of the Minch and what did they do? In legend, they are these blue humanoid creatures, always men I should point out, who live in the Minch, which is the area in the Outer Hebrides, and they largely made their homes in underwater caves. Some people actually called them storm kelpies because locals believed that they created the sudden storms that often lash the Shiant Islands, and this really is the key to what the Blue Men actually do. Now, I should point out that while they're called the storm kelpies, they actually have very little in common with kelpies other than a fondness for water. But the main thing that they are famous for is trashing ships. Now, the Shiant Islands themselves are quite interesting because the islands themselves are reputedly home to Selkies, and the Macodrums of the Outer Hebrides apparently claim a Selkie ancestor. But in terms of the Blue Men, they would keep a lookout, and if they saw any ships approaching their strait, they would then send up an alert cry and leave their caves to go and wreck the ships. So their favourite method was to rise en masse from the churning waters of the Minch and then pull all the hull of the ship down. So they were all kind of like get hold of it and just pull. And this really does echo sailors' reports of ships rocking in a most violent way. Now, as you might imagine, some sailors chose to go the long way around the islands rather than cutting through the strait, so fearsome was the Blue Men's reputation. Now, surprisingly, the Blue Men granted safe passage to fishermen who hadn't annoyed them, so it seems that the Blue Men objected to large vessels like ships, so small fishing boats didn't really catch their attention. The Blue Men were also weather omens in folklore from the Isle of Skye, and if anyone saw the Blue Men in the sea off the headland of Rúthaghrúnis, a wild storm was on the way, and I think this is very much a key to what the Blue Men are related to. It is that sense of a storm suddenly hitting a ship and feeling like what happens next is a little bit out of your control. Before we go any further, I do want to specify, though, that apparently they weren't all bad. According to one tradition, locals would light a candle by the sea for the Blue Men at Halloween and then pour ale into the water. And this offering was to help encourage the Blue Men to deposit seaweed on the beach that the locals could then use as fertiliser. So that seems like a nice sort of degree of respect for these particular creatures. So say you're in your ship and the Blue Men decide that they don't like you going past and they're all hauling on the bottom of your ship. Were you doomed? Actually, no. And even more surprisingly, you could actually ward them off by engaging in a rhyming battle with them. And the chief Blue Man would lift out of the water and challenge the captain. Now, he wasn't challenging the captain to a test of physical strength, but rather intellectual capacity and wit. So the chief would shout a rhyming couplet, and the captain needed to reply with his own rhyming couplet that rhymed with the chief's couplet without actually having time to think about it, and then that would continue until the chief was suitably impressed or admitted defeat, whichever one it happened to be. So if the captain got the last word, then the Blue Men would leave the ship alone and the ship would pass unharmed. If the captain got stuck or failed to match the chief's rhyming prowess, the blue men wrecked the ship. So that does feel a little bit harsh, that you might just not be a particularly wordy person, but you're an excellent captain, and then you end up in this situation. You would be a bit like, drat, that didn't really work in my favour. And one legend actually preserves this folkloric rap battle, and it's related by Donald A. Mackenzie. And in this particular instance, it seems that the ship involved was large with white sails, and the blue men actually found it quite difficult to pull it beneath the waves as they normally would, and even they were quietly impressed by the strength and speed of this particular ship. The chieftain reared up to the top of the waves and shouted his challenge to the captain. But it seems that the captain was a skilled bard, if their exchange is anything to go by. Now obviously their exchange has been translated into English from the Scots Gaelic, but this is apparently what transpired. So the blue chief shouted, "Man of the black cap, what do you say as your proud ship cleaves the brine?" The skipper replied, "My speedy ship takes the shortest way, and I'll follow you line by line," which was responded to with, "My men are eager, my men are ready to drag you below the waves." And the skipper responded, "My ship is speedy, my ship is steady. If it sank, it would wreck your caves." There's so much about that I really like, and I quite like the weird sort of almost exchange of insults that's going on, but in rhyming form. So that is quite an impressive little collection of lines there. And the chief did admit defeat and sank beneath the waves. Bested by the captain, he couldn't seize the ship, so basically the ship then continued on its way. And sadly, the names of the ship and its captain have not survived, so there is obviously the possibility that somebody has invented this after the fact as part of the Blue Men legend, as these things often are. But it's still quite a cool example of how you could actually get past the Blue Men. And I do quite like the fact that there is this almost get out involved, which you don't always get with these kind of creatures. Like, there's no way to sort of rap battle your way out of any kind of shenanigans with a Kelpie. So it's quite cool that there is with the Blue Men. Now, according to legend, people knew that they existed because sometimes crews would actually spot them sleeping under the surface of the water on calm days. And if that was the case, you might get really lucky and you could just kind of sail by them without waking them up. And in one story, a sailor had the rather daft idea to try and capture a blue man who was sleeping on the surface of the water. He was human-sized, and when they got him on board, they bound a rope around him. And the way that it's described is they passed it around him from shoulders to feet, leaving him unable to move his limbs, so they really bound him up quite tight. Yet shortly after this, the crew noticed two blue men swimming after the ship. One of them said, "Duncan will be one man," and the other replied, "Farquhar will be two." Hearing this, the captured blue man leapt up, broke the bonds apparently like spider threads, and then jumped overboard, and the crew watched the three of them swim away. Now, given the tales of the blue men whipping up storms in fury, it seems that the crew were rather lucky that the blue men decided not to punish them on this occasion. Now, some interpretations do add an extra line which is attributed to the captured blue man, in which he names himself, and the general consensus is that the shouts of his compatriots roused him into action to save him the indignity of needing to be rescued. So yes, they have come to fetch him, but he obviously isn't going to allow them to actually come and get him physically, which is quite an interesting one. The other interesting part about that one is it does also suggest that the blue men actually had individual names, and also names that humans would recognise as well, which is quite interesting. So whether the name they give for themselves just sounds like that particular human name, or whether that is what they're actually called, obviously there's absolutely no way to know. Again, it's one of those stories that gets repeated again and again and again, but apart from the names of the blue men, there's no name of the ship, the sailor who decides to capture the blue man, or any identifying details, which is a bit annoying. So is there any way to actually explain the blue men of the Minch? Well, in some versions found in the North Hebrides, they were actually fallen angels. This particular model refers to the angels that were booted out of heaven after following Lucifer, and one group of these angels became fairies when they landed actually on the land. One group became the blue men associated with the sea, and the third group became the nimble men or dancers in the sky. And I will explain what they are in a second. J.G. Campbell recorded the belief, but did add that the stories of the blue men didn't appear in Argyllshire, and nor were there any other mentions of the merry dancers being related to fairies. Now, you might know the merry dancers better by their other names, the Aurora Borealis or the Northern Lights. Now, incidentally, the merry dancers were anything but merry, and while these angels only fell as far as the sky, they were believed to fight an eternal battle among themselves, and that is what we see as a beautiful light show. Conflict inevitably leads to bloodshed, and their blood gathers as a red cloud before falling to earth. and this explains the bloodstones that were apparently found on the ground. So they are believed to be some kind of distant relation of the blue men of the Minch. Now, there are also some suggestions that locals invented the blue men to explain the storms in that area. So following that logic, the blue men are highly localised due to highly localised conditions, and they appear nowhere else around Scotland, nor indeed in the rest of the world, but that's because they reference a changeable stretch of water with volatile storm patterns. Now, we could argue that that's why they seemingly left fishermen alone and targeted larger ships, because it is possible that fishermen were more highly attuned to weather conditions and therefore just didn't set off if a storm was imminent. If they only went out on calm seas, it might look like the blue men had overlooked their presence. Now, it is fascinating that other such waterways haven't likewise developed something similar to the blue men, so it seems that the tales of them just didn't travel far enough to be adopted elsewhere. Another theory draws on the Annals of Ireland, which suggests that Vikings captured North Africans and brought them to Ireland, and then they ended up in these Scottish islands. And the Annals dated from the 6th to the 10th century, although they do also reference earlier writings that have now actually been lost. And Mackenzie describes the tendency of these Moroccan men to stain their skin blue and suggests that they ended up marooned in the islands, which is where they then turned to piracy. Now, that could explain the appearance of the blue men, but also their tendency to wreck large ships while ignoring smaller ones. There is a suggestion that the blue men could refer to blue tattooed Picts attacking the islands in boats, and I think in either case of the blue men being Picts or North Africans, this would give a human genesis to the legend, which might explain the descriptions of the blue men as appearing largely human. It's almost impossible to know where the legend originally came from, but these suggestions do perhaps lend weight to the sightings. Now, obviously, the rhyming rap battle part doesn't really quite fit into the legend if the blue men have a human origin, although that kind of encounter feels far more likely if they had a supernatural origin. And of course, there is always the possibility that they were just real. But I think it is difficult for us to know one way or the other where they came from, but I do think it's quite interesting that there are those potential explanations for where the legend came from, but also why it's associated with that very, very highly localised area. And if we do look at it as being the idea that these are stories passed down about people living in the area, then that would explain why it's so localised, because they were only in that area. So I do find it a really, really interesting legend, and I do think the fact that it's so highly localised also does bear some scrutiny. But I thought that they fitted in quite well with our underwater theme because of the fact that obviously they live underwater, they sleep underwater, and they will drag ships underwater if they're given the chance. So that is the end of this week's episode. Next week I still haven't decided if I'm doing the Loch Ness Monster or if I'm going to do something else. I don't really know yet. We'll see. So again, you'll just have to tune in to find out. But I did want to quickly mention one thing, and I've been doing this over on Instagram. So I had this slightly weird idea that I was going to try and take a photo every day for December just to post an image a day. And then I thought, well, rather than just posting the images, I always post a little snippet of folklore when I put things on Instagram. So rather than just getting a photo, there's like a little bit of a ghost story or a superstition or something like that that goes with it. And I thought, well, I'll do the same thing with these images as well. Because why not? That's obviously what my posts usually are. And on the 7th of December, I went for a haircut, so I put a selfie up to show off my haircut. And I was like, oh, hang on, I haven't actually got any folklore about myself, weirdly enough. I know, I let people make up folklore about myself. That'll be quite funny. And I'm not going to go through all of them because there were some really funny ones. And there were some really sad ones over on Blue Sky as well. But the two that really did make me chuckle, and I felt I have to share these ones. So one of them says, I heard if you go and light 2 black candles in front of a mirror at midnight on New Year's Eve and say Icy Sedgwick 3 times, she will turn up and first foot your house. It's true, I heard it from the friend of my sister's cousin's brother's dog. And that one really did make me laugh. Because I like the fact that just kind of slams a whole load of different bits of folklore together. I like the reference to first footing because obviously that is something that I always do, and there is an episode on first footing if anyone wants to know what on earth that refers to. But then the urban legend reference of hearing it from the friend of your sister's cousin's brother's dog did make me chuckle quite substantially. And the other one that really made me chuckle said, If you count Icy's dimples, they never amount to the same thing twice, forcing the distracted traveller to gaze at them forever. Because I do have dimples when I smile, but I did like that reference to the standing stones, like legends and stone circles and things, that you can never count the same number of stones twice. So yeah, fair play to those two people. Thank you very much for those really funny bits of folklore about me. So yeah, that way, if you want to join in, if you have a look on Blue Sky and just go through my profile, you'll see the answers, and obviously my Blue Sky link and my Instagram links are both in the show notes, and you can see what people have said. But yeah, those two really stood out as really making me chuckle. So thank you for inventing some folklore about me. It's much appreciated. Anyway, as I say, I haven't decided what I'm doing next week. It'll be either the Loch Ness Monster or something else. I actually really wanted to find some underwater ghosts, and I'm really struggling to find any, and that was originally what prompted this theme. So if you know of any legends of underwater ghosts near where you are, please feel free to send me a message and let me know, and then I can actually look into some, but I'm sort of struggling to find any, more generally speaking. Don't forget, our next episode does actually land on the winter solstice, so that is quite cool. But anyway, I'll let you go now, and I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.